Here we go. The Panzironi column explained, and let's go find out what today's topic is. Today's topic will be the glycemic index, the glycemic load. So Panzironi, these are two really very important aspects that affect the food that we bring to our tables.
Absolutely essential because they allow us to assess precisely the danger of carbohydrates. Therefore, also to understand at the time we decide to eat. Something wrong to minimize these harms by precisely trying to combine the various foods we bring to our table.
So let's go and talk about the glycemic index, Mr. Panzironi, because for the first time you have given the opportunity to understand that not all carbohydrates are the same, but it depends on their form, and especially also on the food in which they are found, and therefore may or may not affect our blood sugar.
An important aspect, and so this clearly allows us to understand which foods are most harmful to us. However, unfortunately has led to a distortion of official medicine that is to demonize even more what are simple sugars and instead even hold complex carbohydrates as healthy, even pontificate them. And this is a big problem and a big damage that medicine is doing precisely to public health.
Here, Panzironi. I know that there is a very particular calculation to understand the glycemic index. However, you have realized, thanks also to our editorial staff, a tutorial to give us a better understanding. So I would tell our director to air the glycemic index.
The glycemic index developed by Dr. David Jenkins allows us to assess the rate at which blood sugar rises following the introduction of a food, thereby assessing the availability of the sugars present. It compares the rise in blood glucose after intake of a specific food containing 50 grams of carbohydrate to the 120th minute and compared with what happens with the intake of 50 grams of glucose that has as its standard value 100. The graph used sees in the ordinate the blood glucose as the base 80 milligrams per deciliter, and in the abscissa the elapsed time since the intake of the food. The size of the area of the triangle highlighted in the graph is related to the size of the graph coming from the test performed with the intake of 50 grams of glucose. So if a food has a glycemic index of 80, it means that it induces 80% of the glycemic rise that glucose would have produced. Foods are divided into three classes. With a high glycemic index are those in the range of 71 to 123, in which we find, for example, beer with 110, potato chips with 95, white bread with 90, cereals with 85, but also vegetables such as carrots 75, or pumpkin with 75. Medium glycemic index foods are in the range between 41 and 70, in which we find, for example, polenta with 70, rice with 70, whole wheat bread with 60, and noodles with 55. Low glycemic index foods are those with ranges between 0 and 39, in which we find, for example, legumes with 35, tomatoes with 30, broccoli with 15.
Panzironi, a really very explanatory tutorial, but I would ask you if you could add something maybe for those who have been a little bit distracted and didn't quite understand it, how to calculate it.
Well, I would say simply stick to what are the tables. By the way, I decided to also include them in my book, Living to 120, so just so that we can allow people to evaluate what are the foods that are present in, say, the various ranges. The problem, however, is that this index, glycemic index, fools us in some way because, for example, we have health foods that are instead in the highest range. Example, pumpkins, carrots have a glycemic index of 75, but in reality, to have the same effect as 50 grams of glucose, we would have to take in more than 2 kilograms. So it is clear that this is sometimes misleading information.
Look, but what allows a food to be more or less high glycemic index?
Basically, the presence within that food of the soluble and insoluble fibers, proteins, fats that we know that slow down precisely the digestion, but also the cooking of food. A more cooked food increases the availability of glucose, or for example, the ripening of fruit.
In fact, it is said that spaghetti that is al dente has a lower glycemic index than spaghetti that is cooked. However, in the tutorial, we talked about three ranges of foods: high, medium, and low glycemic index. What would be the recommended foods according to the band?
Certainly, we have to choose those that are low glycemic index. However, we always have to consider the foods that are in it, because again, we have foods that might seem Healthy like legumes that have a low glycemic index but actually have a huge amount of carbohydrates, so clearly they are not good. That's why another index has been studied that is definitely more reliable, which is precisely the glycemic load.
In fact, you have always told us that glycemic load has a more correct assessment, and that's exactly why. To make it better understood by all our viewers, she created a tutorial that explains it to us. Let's see it together.
Glycemic load allows us to assess the glucose density of foods, that is, the amount of glucose present in the individual food. It is calculated using the following formula. Glycemic index by amount of carbohydrates per 100 grams of product divided by 100. Taking an example on pumpkin. Glycemic index 75 times 3.5 grams of sugar per 100 grams of product divided by 100. The glycemic load of pumpkin is 2.62. Foods are divided into 4 classes. Low glycemic load if they are in the range between 0 and 10, in which we find, for example, cherries with 3, carrots with 5, the apple with 6. Medium glycemic load foods are in the range between 11 and 19, in which we find, for example, bananas with 12, steamed potatoes with 16, sweet corn with 13. High glycemic load foods are in the range between 20 and 30, in which we find, for example, polenta with 23, black beans with 26, fettuccine with 29. Very high glycemic load foods are those in the range over 30, in which we find, for example, white beans with 34, macaroni with 53, parboiled rice with 55. The glycemic load also allows us to assess the carbohydrate density of the meal. So if we ingest 200 grams of product, the value of the glycemic load also doubles. Glycemic load.
That's it, the glucose density of the meal. So not just of the food, but just of the meal. This is because of the glycemic load.
An index that is certainly more reliable because it allows us not only to assess the rate of assimilation, but especially the amount of sugar present in the food, because the most important thing is really this. We have to account for how much sugar we introduce at each meal.
That's it. In fact, then in the video, we realized that as the amount of the product increases, obviously the whole glycemic load of the meal also increases accordingly.
Certainly an important aspect, because we always see in the tables reported on 100 grams of product, but actually we have to understand how much product we need to satiate ourselves. I give you the example of canned legumes that might seem healthy because they only have a glycemic load of 4, but with 100 grams, clearly we can't do anything about it, so we need at least of 1 or 2 cans, so it would come to a total glycemic load ranging from 16 to 32. And at the same time, we are going to introduce into our metabolism something like 50 or 100 grams of carbohydrate.
Look, Panzironi, then what range should we stick to?
Well, we simply have to stick to the one of low glycemic load and are present, especially those foods such as vegetables, such as eggs, and by the way, meat, fish. Aged cheese and eggs are 0 glycemic load, so they are the foods that we should eat every day.
So, Panzironi, Lee in his book, all in his book, Living to 120, The Truths No One Wants to Tell You, we can find lists of foods divided by both glycemic index and glycemic load. However, in his latest book, Living to 120, The Research, where there's over 1,000 scientific papers that you've looked up, there's on page 73, here it is. There is an interesting study published by Gerontology regarding the relationship between high glycemic load diet and cognitive aging among elderly without dementia. Here I have it here on page 73.
Yes, it's a very interesting study because we've been told for years now that they still keep saying that our brain rightly goes on sugar, but that high blood sugar doesn't create problems to our metabolism, therefore to our neurons. Actually, it does not. This study tells the truth, which is that they followed 838 people for 15 years, people who were over 50 years old, and they showed that those people who had a diet with a higher glycemic load had higher risk precisely of dementia. This precisely is proof that sugars in the right amount are good for the brain, but the ones we find in the Mediterranean diet certainly damage our neurons.
So, basically you are telling me that here within the book, the research, you have obviously reported a lot of research that confirms this correlation between high glycemic load foods and the pathologies.
Well, of course, we did these chapters. A very interesting chapter precisely devoted to the Mediterranean diet and the problems involved in the Mediterranean diet and its critical issues. And among the critical issues is precisely the fact that this diet involves some foods that are so high in sugar that they have a very high glycemic index and glycemic load.
Thank you, Panzironi. Really very specific about the glycemic index and glycemic load.